Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Morseman. I teach in the history department, and I'm also up here today as a member of faculty council. It's nice to see such a great turnout for this event, especially on a day as beautiful as today when I know you could be outside enjoying yourself. But I think that the hour or so that you will spend in here will be worthwhile, for we have Professor Ann Lane here to talk to us about her interesting work, a topic that is of importance because it has the potential to affect all of us as members of an academic community. The faculty who are here today know that Faculty Council has been working on crafting a policy that would prohibit professors from forming amorous relationships with students. When these relationships happen, they are talked about, but not often talked about openly, not at least at the level that can raise awareness of the potential consequences of such relationships. And that is why we have brought Professor Lane to faculty, staff, and students today to raise awareness. To introduce our speaker, I would like, on behalf of Faculty Council, to thank the academic departments and college offices that have contributed financially to bringing her to campus. They are the Office of the Provost, the Departments of History, Religious Studies, and Psychology, the Program in Women's and Gender Studies, the Charles P. Scott Center for Religious and Spiritual Life, the Office of Institutional Diversity, and the SGA. These folks did not have to contribute to bringing her here, but they did, and we appreciate their support. I would also like to thank Steve and Katie Abbott and the staff of Ross Commons for arranging a special dinner for Ann Lane and student leaders tonight following the lecture. And I understand that there are a few spaces left for dinner, so any of you who did not get a special invitation but who would like to have the opportunity to dine at Ross Commons, actually at Steve and Katie Abbott's home, and the opportunity to speak more intimately with our speaker at dinner, please see me after the lecture. There are about 5 or 6 spaces left, I understand. So please just let me know if you're interested, and you're certainly welcome to come, but we just need to get a sense of the numbers. Ann Lane has had a long and distinguished career. She received her BA from Brooklyn College in 1952, a master's in sociology from New York University in 1958, and a PhD in history from Columbia in 1968. In over 40 years of teaching, Professor Lane has taught at Sarah Lawrence, Rutgers, Columbia, John Jay College and the City University of New York, Colgate University, and most recently the University of Virginia, where she, since 1990, has been both a member of the history department and also the founding director of the Program for the Study of Women and Gender. She is the recipient of academic honors and awards too numerous to mention here, but they include, on the research front, NEH fellowships, a grant from the Ford Foundation, and a grant from the Lilly Endowment at Radcliffe. And for her teaching, she was the recipient just a few years ago of the David Harrison III Award for undergraduate teaching at the University of Virginia. Trained as a historian, Professor Lane has focused her scholarly interest on issues of race and gender in 19th and 20th century America. She wrote her dissertation on the Brownsville Affair, National Outrage and Black Reaction. Since then, she has produced much more scholarship than I can touch on in this brief introduction, but her major works have focused on 2 early 20th century Americans, Mary Ritter Beard, an early historian of American women and an activist, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, and a social reformer. Professor Lane's interest in Gilman led her to write To Herland and Beyond, the life and work of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, as well as articles and an edited volume on this American woman. Her most recent research project, the one she will talk about today, seems somewhat far afield from Professor Lane's earlier work, though certainly questions of gender and power run through them all. There's an interesting story to how Professor Lane decided to pursue consensual relations in the academy, but I'll let her do the telling. For now, please join me in welcoming Professor Ann Lane.
I thought I was going to learn something about me that I didn't know she knew, but she didn't. Give it up. The glasses. And the Constitution of the United States. Okay, so how did I even then past normal retirement age, decide to get involved in the sex life of faculty and students. It happened in the mid-90s when the president of the University of Virginia called 3 of us together, history department and women's studies, Cindy Aaron in the history department, and a feminist attorney. And he said, check out the sexual harassment procedures at UVA and see if we're up to date. So we said, sure. And we sat down and we read them, and they were up to date. They were fine. And then we looked at each other, and I can't remember who said it first, but we said, it doesn't have anything to do with faculty and student sex. We got to do something about addressing the issue of faculty and student consensual sex. So we wrote a policy. Now, to skip back a little bit, in the 70s, sexual harassment was declared illegal. I went to college in the 50s, and nobody imagined what sexual harassment was. I will tell you that most people in college, looking back, can recognize that it was around a lot. But we didn't have a name for it, and when you don't have a name for it, it doesn't exist. It was named finally in the late 60s, and it came out of the radical movement, which was primarily gender-based and led by young men, and it was connected eventually to the Vietnam War. Women like me worked in that organization, in that movement, but we suddenly, at somewhere late 60s, early 70s, said, so what's happening to gender and women? And that's how the women's movement was born in the 20th century. There had been one in the 19th. Well, so anyway, sexual harassment was illegal. Therefore, we all believed, including me, if harassment is illegal, then consent is okay, right? So we continued to believe that for a while. And then in the medical profession, some theorists, women and men, began to question the notion of consent. What does consent mean? You sign a statement saying you give your surgeon permission to have this operation. But what do you know about the operation? What do you know about the danger? So they began to raise the question, these medical theorists, about informed consent. You have to know enough what you're consenting to in order for it to be legitimate. And then in the legal profession, the same thing occurred. You sign something, a contract with your lawyer, but you don't understand that language. So the notion then began, you have to know what you're signing as a consenting person in order for it to be legitimate. And eventually it filtered into the university. We came on board a little late. What does consenting relationship mean between faculty and students? What do students think when they are consenting? And are they of an age, but not even age, are they in a relationship with somebody who has power over them? Do they have any clue when they're 18, 19, 20 years old, or even older, and even graduate students and even medical students? I mean, what does it mean when you are having a sexual relationship with somebody who's in a position of great power over you? Now, I may never get to the question because I'm just thinking of something else, and that is there is practically no other institution in this country that doesn't ban it. The corporate world has long prohibited a person in power from having sex with somebody under his or her jurisdiction. The corporate world, the medical world, the legal world, the military. You can go to jail if you're in the military and you break that rule about having sex with a junior person over whom you have responsibility. But not in the academic world. We held out very long because academics believe that we're independent and autonomous. And we have not a lot of money compared to these other professions and not a lot of prestige, except for students. You take us seriously, but the outside world doesn't take us so seriously. But what we have is independence. We control that classroom. We are in charge, and we can have relationships with students, and nobody can tell us we can't. So that's why we were last, but it finally came. So back to the president, Castine. So we looked around after we said the sexual harassment thing is fine, and we said there's nothing about consent. This was in the mid-90s. So we wrote a policy. And without going into all the details that dealt with graduate students and other people, the one that was the most controversial and the most hated was the policy that said no member of the faculty may have sexual relations with any undergraduate student. And we went into the faculty senate to get this thing passed, and the head of the chair of the history department, Melvin Leffler, thank you, held up the policy in his hand and said to the faculty senate, "This policy is so reasonable, so legitimate, that I can't imagine any of my colleagues not supporting it." And then they voted it down. On the way out, I was talking to a psychologist who was close to retirement, and I said to her, "You have never been involved with any feminist activities. You are a world-renowned psychologist. Why'd you vote against it?" And she said, "I had to change dissertation advisors 3 times because of overtures." She was then very close to retirement. And I said, "Would you say that publicly?" She said, "No, and if you say it, I'll deny it." So I got a clue that this was a secret world that we were touching on, and so it was. The ethos of the university has always discouraged sexual relationships between faculty and students. And yet this belief has been violated forever. When I came of college age in the 50s, it was getting married to your professor. That was a goal for a lot of students. You didn't go to school to get a BA, you went to school to get an MRS. And better if it's a professor than if it's just an ordinary student like you. So that was in the culture. That was a move up. In fact, the university, until a few years later, was really seen as a place for men and women, teachers and students, to find husbands and wives. And there was basically nothing wrong with it in terms of cultural attitudes, but it wasn't talked about a lot. I mean, people still didn't want to pass it off as something casual, but it was all over the place. Ask almost any woman of my age in the academy, and she has a story. Not always a bad story, but usually, and not always about herself. But there are lots of stories in the university world about this kind of situation. But what I want to get to is the post-1960s world, because in the post-1960s, many professors came to see the young people coming into the university and the colleges as being sexually free. And they were not free like that when they were their age. And when I started to write this book, I can't believe how many male colleagues, and I got lecture tours all over the country and got hundreds of stories, but how many men, some I knew and some I didn't know, said to me, "You know, when I got married 20 years ago, we were all virgins. And now these kids come in and they have these short skirts and these low-cut blouses and they're all sexual and it's driving us all crazy and I can't help myself." And they would go on and on telling me while I'm writing a book about this subject about how impossible it was not to make overtures, not to have sex with students. And this went on. And anyway, I would say to them, your job is to teach them. And secondly, they're not dressing like that for you. They're dressing like that for young men of their own age. Most of them really do think of your age as something yucky, you know. But they were also wrong because there was a lot of relationships that did emerge. There was a lot of sex that did emerge. Eventually, this issue hit a cultural nerve. And we now talk in the last number of years about issues of power and violence against children. These are things that were not talked about in my young years. Violence between spouses and lovers and parents, people assaulting their parents. And it makes us begin to wonder, what's the reality of love really all about? We now know that members of the clergy molest child parishioners and commit adultery with their followers, that some judges exact sexual favors from those dependent on their authority, that some male naval officers, and some of you may not remember this, but many of you will, behaved outrageously toward female officers. We don't know whether this behavior is more common than it used to be, but we sure know more about it. And that is as a result of email and the internet and television and the general lowering of the sense of privacy that we now live in. So the concept of sexual harassment is so new that, well, I think I got to start cutting, otherwise I'm not going to get to questions. So while everybody opposes sexual harassment in principle, the question of consent is more complicated, because consent means that you are giving your consent. And there are people who believe, many of them, perfectly legitimate people, who believe that it is a right of a person, adult, over 18, to have sex with anybody she or he wants, that it's nobody's business, not the universities, not the people's parents, it's not the law, because the law allows this for people over 18. And consensual sex, and I put it in quotes, some of you may not, occurs between women professors and male students. And it occurs between men and women of the same sex. But the overwhelming percentage of sex between faculty and students is male faculty and female students. And in many of these relationships, and I've seen now many of them, and it is true that the sad stories come to me. People who have happy stories, I'm not publicizing them because they're a little embarrassed, but the sad stories come. Women who drop out of school, women who collapse emotionally, who seek therapeutic help, who are devastated because they entered a relationship at 18 or 19 with somebody who said, don't worry, I'm going to leave my wife. When I was teaching at Colgate, there was a man in the history department who must have said that to years of young women. He was married with 3 kids. And every year there'd be another one graduating, devastated because he hadn't left his wife for her. So it was pretty awful, and that was a small college where I could see the ramifications. But the question of what do you do about consensual relations touches on issues of privacy, sexual freedom, professional responsibility, and eventually the meaning of the word consent. Is there something different and special about the world of the university that sets us apart from other institutions? Yes and no. The relationship between teacher and student, somewhat parallel to that between clergy and parishioner and therapist and client, requires the kind of trust from a student that is at base intellectual but goes far beyond the intellectual. To engage in new ways of thinking, to challenge oneself, and I'm speaking about students, to think of something new that you hadn't thought of before. It's very exciting, but it's also dangerous, intellectually and emotionally dangerous. It's the best kind of learning for your students to suddenly grasp and study that which has never occurred to them before. For the student, it's risky, but it's very important for students to take those risks if they're going to grow into autonomous adults. Students and their parents expect, as they have a right to, that the university will establish a safe and secure place in which students can study and learn in ways that will help them with the adult world they are soon to enter. Most faculty, staff, and administrators take that responsibility seriously, recognizing that their product, young people, makes their work very special and important. Young people think of themselves as adults. I'm sure most of you in this audience think of yourselves as adults. And as teachers, we have to honor that sense of feeling, recognizing that you are not yet fully adult, And you won't know that until you move on and get out into the work world, discover a world you had not imagined, and you will face issues you had not faced earlier. A lot of people oppose bans on sex between faculty and students. A lot of people think that even if they're not good, they shouldn't be opposed because they're illegal and they will only cause students and faculty to avoid them. They also believe that it isn't going to work, and having a regulation that doesn't work is worse than having no regulation at all. I remember a faculty member who opposed, and it was interesting because it split all the usual divisions. Liberals were split, conservatives were split, feminists were split, anti-feminists. Nobody fit a neat category. And there was a friend of mine who was many years my junior who said in an open meeting fighting our effort to get this passed at UVA, I didn't fight in loco parentis when I was a student to embrace it when I'm a member of the faculty. And she ultimately came around many years later, but her feeling that, and what I learned from her and from others is that when they, as faculty, think about a policy, they think about themselves when they were students. She thought about herself as a student rather than as a member of the faculty. I was talking to my family doctor because everybody was talking about this issue and my name was up there. And so she's examining me and she said to me, you know, when your policy came up, I would have opposed it because I was thinking of myself as a student. And boy, would I have hated anybody telling me about my sex life. But she said, I'm married now for the second time. And my son, I have a stepson who's 17 years old. He's a baby. He's going off to college. And I realized that's what I was like when I was a student going to college. And she said, for the first time, I realized that when I think of myself in college, I think of myself as an adult until I meet somebody who's in college. And then I realize they're not fully adult yet. They can be manipulated. They can have notions about propriety that they will come to challenge as the years pass. And I had a lot of faculty who opposed it, who finally came to realize that you have to think of yourself not what you were like when you were 17, 18, and 19 in those terms, but think of yourself now looking back at the level of your maturity. The other problem that those who oppose the bans raise is, what about all the women who make the overtures to the men? And I'm using the gender, although, as I said, it's not fully that way. And what about all the, and a woman said this to me, I was at Cornell for a year, and there was a couple that came up to me, and I began to think I could spot those guys. I was so used to talking to them, and I felt that his wife, who was about 25 years younger, was a student, and I didn't want to talk to him, and he kept pestering me about what am I working on. And I finally told him, and he said, why are you wasting your time on such a ridiculous subject? And he walked away. And then she said to me, well, what do you do when the women come running after the professors? What are they supposed to do? And I said, they're supposed to say no. They might want to say thank you, but no thank you. It is the responsibility of the person in authority for that relationship, no matter how many students, male or female, make the overtures. It's very hard for male professors, by the way, to turn down students. I don't mean it's hard for them to feel it, but it's hard for them to express it. It's uncomfortable. It's an embarrassment because the overtures are usually pretty subtle, and they see where they're going, and they don't know how to say anything without offending the young students. So I've had a lot of male professors say it's awkward, and they feel uncomfortable. But everybody's got problems is my basic response. Just as the policy was starting to be discussed at UVA, a teacher in the anthropology department, who I knew slightly, came up to me and he said, hey, you know, my marriage just broke up. And I did, of course, what everybody does when you marry. I go look for somebody to screw fast. And the closest ones there are the grad students in my department. So I started a relationship with one. And then I went to hear your talk, and I realized I made a mistake. I should have gone to a grad student in another department. And I thought, he's right, though, because graduate students in a different department have very little relationship with professors. I still felt he could have gone out of the community and gone to the local bar and found a secretary or something. I mean, he didn't have to pick a student, but he got it on some level that you don't have those relationships with somebody who is very close to your profession. And the thing, of course, and I don't have time to get into this, the self-esteem that many young women have depends upon, in this culture, being sexually attractive. We are still not treated fairly and legitimately and equally. And what we have that the world says is good is sexual appeal. It doesn't say our intellectual work, our emotional life, all the good things about us that are like what men have. And so this kind of relationship only makes the woman feel more, since she's in college and with a teacher, that what he really finds appealing and important about her is the relationship rather than her knowledge, her studying, her ideas, and it only makes her coming to adulthood harder. Girls and women, as we know, are socialized to think of others, not of themselves, and allow often others to define who they are. Our job as teachers is to help our female students look to their own accomplishments for validation of their talents. And I will tell you that women professors often suffer with the same issues if they don't face them early on in their lives. It's disturbing to learn that girls are probably more self-confident at the age of 10 than they will be at 13 or 19. Or if their self-esteem fails to develop, than they ever will be in their lives. We see the connection between the 6-year-old boy who pulls up the skirt of a girl while his friends laugh, the 12-year-old boy who touches a girl's breasts in the hallway at school, and the fraternity boys who bond in a gang rape. A sexual relationship between a professor and a student is on that same continuum, I think, an idea that many may have difficulty believing. In college, a supportive relationship with a teacher can be a safety net, a place of refuge and trust, or it can be a space in which the sexual objectification of the student, a concept with which she is long familiar by the time she is in college, is reinforced. And I think teachers have to realize the socialization of their female students. The women students we encounter are gripped by tension. They're trying to develop a sense of self-worth while dealing with the cultural messages that demand obedience, passivity, and care for others. They have to learn that they count and that they need to deal primarily with themselves. And many college women have come from homes with very loving and protective parents, and that makes them, in a sense, vulnerable even more when they get out into the world and discover that not everybody is as kind as their parents. It's also a heady thing for a student to be singled out by a professor and told how attractive she is. And a lot of male teachers don't know how to deal with females except in a sexual way. I don't mean physically sexual, but they don't know how to talk to girls. So they talk to them the way they would talk to women, and they're not very, especially men who came of age at a certain time. I'm trying to rush through this. Now, some students are more vulnerable than others because of their race, limited financial resources, sexual orientation, or history of sexual abuse. And as teachers, we don't know that. All we see is a room full of brand new faces, and we're going to bring them into the heady world that we occupy. We don't think about the students who have faced racism, who have been sexually abused, who are on scholarships that they're afraid they will lose if they don't say yes. And as my professor said to me at University of Virginia, who I trusted and who was not one of these people, he said to me, but you know, he's about my age, he said, you remember how you looked like a girl when you were in college? You wore bobby socks and big sweaters and no makeup. And I look at the girls in my classes now, and they have high heels and they have lots of makeup and they're gorgeous. And he said, I said, well, do you fantasize? And he said, do you ban fantasies? And I said, no. He said, I fantasize. I would never do anything. But I do think about it because they are so different from the girls I knew when I was in college. The thing is that if students often exaggerate the brilliance of their teachers, teachers often exaggerate the sexual experience and sexual sophistication of female students. Many women wear what to middle-aged and older men appears to be provocative clothing, and these students seem to be more mature and composed, more centered, more in charge of themselves. So when I began to work on this book, I thought I wasn't going to have so many surprises. I'd spent a number of years collecting stories, and I was shocked. I was astonished at how much information students have about their professors. Students gossip. They share information. And I realized, as all people do on a lower rung of the people above them. I was also astonished at how clueless faculty members, especially males, are concerned about their impact on students. And I was astonished at how many professors, primarily male, are appalled at the idea that their colleagues would be engaged sexually with students. Their colleagues would not do that. And I've had so many teachers say that to me, although I knew it wasn't true. I knew there were people, their colleagues in their own departments, and they couldn't believe it. It was so appalling to them that they wouldn't allow themselves to think that their colleagues would behave like that. Is there a profile? Various colleagues across the nation have explained to me that these transgressive professors came primarily from departments of English, sociology, history, political science, art, biology, from schools of arts and sciences, from business, medicine, and law. So it's everywhere. And it's not obviously most teachers, but a few teachers can do a lot of damage. I have also been told that it's mostly gay men, straight men, lesbians, older men, men about to retire, young men who grew up in a sexually free culture, white men, Latinos, black men. Did I leave anybody out? In effect, it's everybody. We don't have a profile. And what we need now, and immediately, is an open and continuing conversation in colleges and universities, in professional organizations, to discuss the guiding principles of ethical behavior. Students are the least powerful in the entire college world, and they need the education to understand their vulnerability and how they can protect themselves. And we need to start that discussion now. We all know about the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, do no harm. Perhaps we need a comparable pledge in the teaching profession. We have hundreds of tomes written over hundreds of years describing the goals and aspirations of institutions of learning. No one has said yet that these institutions should be safe from sexual misconduct. A book came out, actually somebody sent me from here an interview with a man in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a journal that's inside the academic world. I had seen it already. And he is a man who's a professor of psychology at UCLA, and he thinks sex between faculty and students is a good idea. And he was interviewed, and he has published, co-authored 2 other books. One is called The Ninth Amendment, and the other is on some other general subject, also co-authored. But he's coming out with a book in October. I've already ordered it from Barnes & Noble on sex between faculty and students and why it's good. So what I did was skim through the book on the Ninth Amendment, because what he says in the opening chapter is that the Ninth Amendment makes it clear that sex between faculty and students is protected by the United States Constitution. Did you know that? So here's the Constitution of the United States. And I want to go, it's the Ninth Amendment. What's the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or press. People have the right of peaceful assembly. So that's the one we know, right? Second one is a well-regulated militia must remain in this country for the people to bear arms. Now remember, the amendments were written after at the same time as, but in addition to the United States Constitution, and we're talking about the 1790s. But these people were very smart, so they said things that they wanted to last forever, but they also knew that as the country continued to develop, there would be other things to do that they hadn't thought of. So this is Madison doing a lot of the amendments. Amendment 3, no soldier shall be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. Amendment 4, the right of people should be safe against unreasonable searches. Amendment 5, no person shall be held to answer for a capital infamous crime without a grand jury. Amendment 6, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. In the 7th, in common law, where the value is in controversy is more than $20, the right of trial by jury shall be upheld. 8, cannot have excessive bail. I'm going to skip 9 and get to 10. The power not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. Okay, so what's the Ninth Amendment that allows Mr. Abramson to say the Ninth Amendment allows students and faculty to have sex? The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's it. You wrote a whole book. And all that means then people can have sex with 2-year-olds, because it's not, I mean, it's nuts. So I've lost interest in his argument. I mean, he's going to come out with a book in October, and I will read it. But the whole book on the Ninth Amendment deals with this particular amendment that he says makes it clear that faculty and students can have sex. I think I will stop, because I really hope you have questions. So where are we? Are you interested? Thank you. Oh, let me just add one. Sexual harassment is illegal, and that was the 70s. And so it seemed reasonable to think that consent is okay. And now we're questioning the notion of consent. Is consent legit? Is a person of 18 capable of relationship with a professor? Not capable of having sex with others, but we're talking only about the student-teacher relationship. Because in the corporate world, they're not talking about age. They're talking about just relationship of person in authority to the person under that. And the military has nothing to do with age. So the age at the university, I think, adds a little something to the equation, on top of all the other arguments that there is a question of the age of young people, but it's not the critical issue. So does this make any sense? Oh, the surveys, okay. I prepared, I'm not a sociologist, I can't do surveys, but I have a very smart TA, teaching assistant at UVA, and he prepared 3 surveys for faculty, for undergraduates, and for graduate students. And people often think that even though there's no way to catch who you are, there's no name, we're not asking for names, we don't ask location, school, anything. We just want answers to questions. People often think there's some code hidden someplace so you can really figure out who it was who's asking, but these really are like all surveys. We want to find out what your positions are, what your feelings are about these questions, about relationship between faculty and students. And so we ask a lot of questions about your age, where you come from, all kinds of things, just to locate it. And I'm handing these out all over the country, and some people still feel uncomfortable. So if you feel at all uncomfortable answering it, feel free not to. But it is just, you're going to be one of many, I hope thousands, to answer this. So we'll find out how much is going on around the country. It's very hard to know because people keep it secret. This is not something that they casually talk about ordinarily. So I would appreciate it if you would take a look at the surveys, and if you feel uncomfortable, just fill them out and give them to you.
The student ones are over on that side. The faculty ones are over on this side. And we also provided them in case you just want to get a sense of the research process and the questions that she's asking. But if you want to return them to me, please, no names, I will take them at the end.
By the way, I'm also looking at a lot of policies across the country to see what policies colleges have dealing with sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is against the law, so schools often have a sexual harassment policy which reflects the law and just announces to its community that harassing a student is illegal. It's a federal law, and you can go to jail for it, although it rarely happens. The consent issue is not in that category. So the question is, how do you feel about the issue? What does consent mean in a situation where one person has authority over another? And that's not illegal. A lot of schools are dealing with it. Most of them discourage it, but they don't oppose it. I just got one from Colgate, which I had written many years ago. I don't think this is the one I'd written. This one is better than the one I wrote, but it has a whole thing about the EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission definition of sexual harassment. The last sentence says, furthermore, amorous relations between teacher and student or between administrator and student are fundamentally asymmetrical and contradict both professional ethics and Colgate policy. So this is a school that has very clearly said it's against our rules. And that question is up to the schools individually because it's not a law in the country. So, what do you think about it?
Questions?
Yes?
I'm wondering, where do you draw a line as far as, I mean, the questionnaire is talking about TAs, but how, or in your opinion, what should it be determined based on, like, a coach or an assistant coach or someone who's closer in age but does have potentially a higher power relationship?
I think it should apply. The TA is a teaching assistant in a university who's a graduate student. And the rule that we wrote in UVA was that no TA can have a person in his class with whom he is sexually involved. And so if you have somebody with whom you are involved, that person cannot take the class the semester you teach it. But other students are not off limits. For grad students and undergraduates, they can make their own arrangements legally and with the acceptance of this policy. But if one is teaching the other, that's what does it. It's the power relationship. So, if it's a sports person who has authority over you, it's off limits. If you drop out of the sport, it's back on again. So there's a flexibility in it that you have to figure out each in your own school, because schools are different. Yeah.
Since our faculty are discussing this right now, and it's an academic community, and we've got people who care about this often by empirical data, I'm curious, like, who are some of the people out there doing research with outcome studies of academic success and mental health outcomes for young people who have found their way into these relationships? Do you understand what my question is?
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know that we'll ever be able to get much information on that question. I mean, I've had students who dropped out of school. There are students who have those relationships and they're okay.
So it's only anecdotal.
It's only anecdotal, which is the way most situations start. Most scholarship starts, and it may take a couple generations before we accumulate enough material, or at least many years before we accumulate it. Because people don't talk about it. I mean, the first problem is we don't know. We don't even know how common it is. And it's true that when you talk to a student body, you will get, I get emails. I mean, we now have something called emails that allows students to send something without anybody knowing about it. And whenever I go to talk someplace, there will be people dropping notes, but they won't talk to me in front of other people. And then I put my email address up, and that's the easiest thing, because it's an issue that a lot of people don't want to talk about. It's embarrassing, scary. Yes, so it's all anecdotal. But that, I suspect, is what most of what we know about anything in the world is largely anecdotal. I'm a historian, and I have a lot of suspicions about sociological surveys. But my sociology friends think they are more accurate than anecdotal. I don't know. But it's more than we think. I mean, that much I'm pretty sure, because I was surprised when it started about how many responses I got. And I, for example, this is not atypical. A mother called me who's living somewhere in the north, and she has a college-age daughter, and she told me that she calls every school that she wants, that the daughter is interested in, and says, "Do you have a policy about sex between faculty and students?" And if they don't, she scratches it off the list. And then told me her story of how she thinks it made serious assault on her life. She gave up graduate school. She got married quickly, had kids, never really filled ambitions because it was so devastating to her. And she doesn't want her daughter facing it. Other people are more, it comes, it goes. Although I had one woman, she's one of my favorite stories, a gorgeous blonde, looked like a movie star, very sophisticated, very smooth. And when she was in college, she had many, many lovers, and she was one of those people who loved having lots of lovers, and she was easy with it. She got into her master's program, and then there was a professor who made overtures, and she had an affair with him. It was nothing. And he told her he was going to leave his wife. She actually thought he would. He didn't. She dropped out of that master's. She finished the master's, but she was going to go on for a PhD, and she no longer wanted to stay there. So she moved to another PhD program, which was not as prestigious as school. She then got married very quickly and had children, and was still working on the PhD, and that's the point at which she came to hear my talk. She came to talk to me afterwards. We went off campus to talk, and she said, "I thought I was cool and that sex never bothered me until I just listened to you, and it's what's slowed down my career. I didn't stay at the place I wanted. I got married very quickly to sort of protect myself and had children very quickly, and I've never finished, and I don't know if I'm ever going to finish. And it never occurred to me until I listened to you, the long-term implications." And I think that is also true. People come 20 years later and say, "It didn't occur to me." And we all do that about everything in life. As you get to be 30 and 40, you start thinking of things you did when you were younger that had an effect on who you became, that you hadn't, good and bad. But you don't think about it at the time frequently. And I think that has happened a lot. Yeah.
Well, with respect to that mother's inquiries at the various institutions that her daughter's interested in, do we have any evidence to suggest that institutions that adopt a policy banning amorous relationships have any less of it going on?
No, but I think I was talking to my brother today because we had some conversation earlier in the afternoon, and the question was raised, so you have a policy, how do you enforce it? Well, it's easy to enforce if somebody is not tenured, which gives them a much more unreliable future. But for the faculty who are tenured, what are you going to have a public? It was getting very complicated just to talk about. What do you do with the faculty who you find out have done this? And I was talking to my brother earlier, a criminal lawyer, and he said, state a policy, write a policy saying faculty cannot have so-called consensual relations with faculty. I said, yeah, how do you enforce it? He said, well, you don't enforce it with tenured people. You probably don't. But when people come into the university or the college, they have to sign a statement saying they will uphold that policy. That's a commitment that will be legally binding. So you may not do much with the faculty you have now, but you start now, and in 20 years, it'll be a different school. And he said, because I had explained to him at the difficulty to fire somebody from a tenured position, you need a trial. I mean, you need, it's very complicated, and most schools wouldn't touch it. They certainly wouldn't touch it, and I understand it. So I think although in the places that I have been where there were obvious professors close to retirement, the dean, sometimes the provost or the president called them in and said, we have a lot of stuff on you. Why don't you retire? So there have been retirements. I mean, I think the university is a place that isn't going to go whole hog and start lining up professors and shooting them. They're going to make a policy, and they're going to try to make it work. And I think it's a good idea to think about the new people coming in and have them sign a statement. He said it's a binding statement. Go talk to have a lawyer draw up a statement that says, I will uphold the policy on no sex with students. You sign that statement, you then, if you violate it, are in trouble. Give up on the tenured faculty. It's not going to work. It would be too humiliating. It would be on the front page of the New York Times. Columbia University is firing 22 tenured faculty. I mean, it wouldn't work. Schools wouldn't do it.
But it's also raising awareness among students that if they, have an overture from a faculty member that this is against college policy and that they can do something about it.
Yes, and that's one of the things that they now do at some of these schools with the first year students coming in, and they give them all the rules at the school and they tell them what it's about. They make a big point of that one, that you are not supposed to have any sexual relationship, amorous relationship with a member of the faculty, and if somebody does this is the person you go to. Because a lot of students don't know, and they agree thinking it's going to be bad if they don't agree, but armed with the knowledge that this is a rule in the school, if they are not interested in the relationship, they have a way to protect themselves. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I'm a little uncomfortable with the notion of consent, because of all the problems with it, and I'm very uncomfortable with making students into children. But I think there's a way that this could be framed, and I'm wondering if it's happened elsewhere, where it's more like secondhand smoke and less like sex. Right, and so that when these relationships happen, they affect everyone in the classroom.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if any policies have been written more from that point, sort of environment it creates at the college because of these.
Sure, that's part of the explanation, but it doesn't change holding the. I mean, you can't talk about infantilizing when it's in the corporate world, when it's in the military. It's everywhere.
All sexual relationships happen in conditions of structural inequality, and so the consent is a problematic notion, right? And from the liberal subject who goes around consenting to sex doesn't seem to exist in the real world, as far as I can see. But so I'm just wondering if these are ever framed for us as a faculty, as somebody who wants to support some
Sure,
sort of policy.
sure.
Is there a way to frame this
Well,
more like secondhand smoke and less around this liberal subject who can go around consent?
Well, but I don't see how it's unconnected to it. That relationship is poisoning the environment as well as the.
It's a more compelling notion
Okay.
to me than consent or treating students like children.
Well, but it wouldn't be poisoning the environment if it were a good relationship. So the implication is that the relationship is damaging the environment.
Well, it sexualizes a professional context in a way that not everyone's in it. So those two,
Yeah.
I might argue that a student and a professor might be able to consent to sex to the extent that anyone can consent if we're going to stick within that notion of consent. But it seems to me that everybody around them then has to also partake in that consent, and that seems
Okay.
I
Okay.
guess that's what I'm wondering, because
Sure.
I feel, particularly given the sex wars of the 80s, particularly given the hysteria over pedophilia and stranger danger, whatever, I have a lot of ambivalence about that particular framing of it, and I have ambivalence about making college students out to be non-subjects in a way, So I'm just wondering, is there a policy that frames it like secondhand
Write your
smoke?
own. Do it.
Maybe I'm saying it more to Amy and the
But
committee and saying.
that also speaks, and other faculty council members, you can speak of as well, but also speaks to something already within our sexual harassment policies, which speaks to third-party victimization, that no one's really aware of, that it's a hostile work environment.
Right.
If you see this happening and you feel like it's affecting you, but that's not something that's very public.
If you make it a hostile work environment, that's sexual harassment. That's illegal.
That's right.
because that's one of the two bases for the federal law. Is,
And continuing on that
Yeah.
third party, from your anecdotal evidence, from what you've heard, can you give us some examples of what you've heard where third parties have been affected by?
yes, but it's more ephemeral even than the other, because students will say, I won't take that teacher because he has sex with students. Men are particularly offended by it, because it rarely happens that it's a male student being hit on. And they feel the environment, I've talked to many young men, they feel the environment's been sexualized, that the teacher prefers the pretty girls, that the teacher is not paying attention to teaching, but paying attention to sexual pleasures, visual as well as physical. And they feel deep offended. They will never say anything. I mean, they say it to me, but they won't. It's too embarrassing to go. I mean, students don't want to say too many things publicly, but they do find it uncomfortable. And yes, I was going to Europe, and I was sitting in an airport, and there were these two young women who thought I didn't understand English. So they were talking about school here, not the school, but school in the United States, and they were going to be seeing this teacher, and they were listing all the women he had screwed. And they had two reactions. One was, why didn't he pick me? And two was, it's really disgusting, because that's all we talk about. At the very end, I said something in English, and they got very embarrassed. But it's hard to get people to talk about how they feel. First of all, they don't know how they feel. If you're not used to talking about your sexual feelings about other people, it's kind of hard to start. And most people do it with somebody they care about, rather than in a public forum when they're talking about a social issue. So it's not an easy subject for students or faculty. Yeah.
I thought I would just go back to something you said about how the tenured area is sort of the untouchable. I mean, how does an institution then, how are they supposed to deal with that when there are students who are being affected outside of?
Well, if you're going to fire a tenured faculty, there has to be some kind of trial. If somebody comes to class drunk, somebody gives pot to students, I mean, something that is clearly illegal, you've got a very strong case. But since consensual sex is still not in that category, although it may be in 15 years, it's not in that category now, where it is prohibited every place and seen as something as bad as giving drugs to kids. Then it will move along. I mean, I think it's a matter of time until we begin to explore the issue and stop talking about consensual sex. The other piece, and I should stick this in here too, especially concerning the person who's concerned about how easy it was. While I was working on this policy at UVA, there was a young man in the English department, a young assistant professor, who had fallen in love with a young graduate student in the English department. Just as we were working on this policy, I went to talk to him about it. And what he did, and this is, I think, a way to deal with those relationships, he went to the chair of the department. They both went to the chair of the department, and then they went to the dean, and they said, we are in love, and we're going to live together, and we hope we're going to get married. And it was okay. And I was okay with that, because they spoke to somebody. They were very public. They moved in together. They eventually married and had kids, and it didn't work for her as well, of course, because the grad students were mad at her because she was going to dinner parties with their faculty. And she was getting privileges they weren't, which is true. But it was a public event, and they were serious about their relationship, and nobody had a problem with it. So if the school wants to have that as an alternative, you want to have a relationship with a student, you go to this office and just tell the person. I don't mean public. I don't mean putting it in the newspaper. You put yourself on record, because if it's somebody who does it every year, who has a whole history of students, that person is not going to come every year and put the new name in. So we're talking about somebody who is serious about it in a relationship.
Did that woman finish her degree?
Which one?
The woman who went to talk to the dean and so forth, did she finish her degree?
Which?
The one who got married.
Oh, she finished her degree. She finished her degree and she got a job at Yale, which was his alma mater. And so the grad students were even angrier. She was very brilliant. They both were. They were angry, they thought, because she had a letter of recommendation from him. And maybe it was. I mean, although he was her husband, so I don't think people would take awfully seriously his letter of recommendation. And then after a couple of years, she finished her book. They brought her back to UVA, and they married and had kids. And yes, she finished her degree and has a very thriving career. But you're raising an interesting point, because often the woman doesn't finish her career. Yeah.
So we just touched on the question, but you talk a lot about the negative aspects of these relationships. I'm wondering, do you have any examples or what do you think is possible for these to be positive relationships? Are there a lot of examples in your experience of teachers and professors falling in love, and also
Sure.
concerned about restricting those relationships and so forth?
Sure. I tell you, yes, sure. There are many that don't last, but they were fine while they lasted. Not a lot of relationships that young people have don't last, and there were a lot that did last. And I did find that the ones that lasted and they have long-term marriages never wanted to talk to me about the source of that relationship. They were kind of embarrassed, even though it was at a time when it was considered okay. You see, there are two basic categories that I guess I'm dealing with. One is a genuine relationship that the two people have, and they are of different levels. But they care. But it's a serious caring. They may not end up spending 100 years together, but they're serious about each other. And then it's the other, where these, and it is primarily but not exclusively men, who just have sex with students all the time. They're often married, and they are bored, and they have a whole history. And there are a lot of, they're predators. And those are the ones that could be stopped. Maybe not fired, because I don't know how you prove that if they have tenure, but they could be stopped with some kind of pressure from the university. And those are the ones that I think are in danger. And they do more damage because they go through lots of women. And there are some women who do that. My very worst story is a woman at my university who used to be a friend of mine, and I don't think she will be if I ever get this book. I don't name her. She won't know. But I mean, she'll know because she'll recognize it. But there are women who are terrible too, and gay and straight, and lesbians. And so it's all over the place. But the worst stories are from heterosexual men, mostly middle-aged and married. They don't work for the women. I don't know if they work for them, but it doesn't help the women to get caught in those relationships, because they go on forever. I mean, their numbers go on for decades. But the genuine relationships, I think a school has to decide. I mean, there's no set policy. Schools should decide what it wants to do, but it has to do something to protect the situation. For example, there are wives or husbands who are taking courses from their husbands or wives, or children, adult children, and it's always made public, and that person has somebody else grading them. If you are a daughter or a son in college, and you take your father or mother's course, it's public, and somebody else grades it, reads the papers. It's open. That's what you're going to have if it's going to be a situation like that. And the people who are serious about a relationship won't mind having it looked at. It's the ones hiding it that ought to be stopped, mostly. Yes?
Just a quick comment. What you're describing parallels very nicely with all due respect to what Laura said before. The doctrine of informed consent in the medical community.
Sure.
You talk about voluntariness, the power issue. You talk about the question of competence, which is really what you're getting at the age thing, I take it. It's not that they're idiots or infantile, but that they have access to a different set of information than professors presumably do. And then the third aspect of informed consent is traditionally this disclosure of info. And you're a chuckle out of the Office of Legal professor-student relationships, but this kind of full disclosure then would be your best bet at distinguishing between those kinds of rare relationships that might be on the even and the kind of predatorial relationships that you're seeing much more often.
Yeah, and the thing that's so interesting is that so many other professions have it, and we don't. The psychological, the medical, I mean, the legal, the corporate. Most of the people who work for not on their own, work for a group, have some kind of rule like that, and we're fighting it. And we're talking about students. It's really it's interesting to ponder why we are so hostile to this idea. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand then whether the concern that you're expressing in the policies that you're talking about wanting to have in place and to be enforced is about the sex itself and the fact of sex, or if it's about the secrecy of it. Because a policy like the one that James was just describing seems to me kind of driven by a different set of concerns than one that says any sexual relationship, regardless of consent or not, and regardless of openness or not, and regardless of consequence, that is, whether these people ultimately stay together for years or don't, those seem to me like two different sets of concerns.
Well, but I said, while we were doing the UVA proposal, there was a couple who fit that, and yet they came out publicly. They spoke to the dean and the chair. I have no problem with that. You know, it's partly the secrecy, and it's also partly the whole situation. But if people are going to go to their chair or their dean or their somebody and say, we have fallen in love. I'm not saying that you wait 5 years till you finish your degree. I mean, I'm not doing that. It's that part. I think each school can decide for itself how to handle it. Can certainly do it as they do in other professions and say, go on record with somebody. It stops the predators, you see, because they're not going to go and report themselves every couple of years with a new person. And it's the predators who I think do the real damage rather than the genuine relationships. And there are more of those than I thought there were. It's not most. It's nowhere near most. It's minority. But it's still a lot of damage done to a lot of people. Yeah.
You continue to bring up the idea of like adults looking back when they were students and students being young. But in that respect, I think students are involved in creating policies about this because they're half of the relationship. What role should students play in making these policies on college campuses?
I think that's, again, up to the school. I think you can have open forum and have students come and discuss it. But the responsible person is not the student. For example, in a sexual harassment case, the person being harassed is not legally involved. It's the person who's harassing who is breaking the law. The other is a victim. So I'm saying that in this case, the student, it's not an age thing as much as it is a power thing. The person in the less powerful situation.
Although you kept bringing up the idea of the male professor that doesn't know how to say no when a female student approaches them.
Well, it's because men usually are the ones who make the overtures. And I don't mean in these situations, but in general. So it's more uncomfortable. I've had men who find it embarrassing to say to me, for example, there was a guy at college who was a hunk. Happily married, a couple of kids. He was a very good-looking guy, very smart. He had tons of students going in and out of his office making overtures. He allowed himself not to notice. And I once pointed it out to him, and he said, I don't want to hear about it. He was too embarrassed to have to say, leave my office. I mean, it was not the best solution, but he was so uncomfortable. And I think that men often find themselves in an uncomfortable situation when a woman is making an overture because it doesn't matter hurting her. I don't know. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But it seems to me that it's easier, it's more in the context of what we expect for a woman to turn down a man who's making an overture than for a man to feel comfortable doing it. But I don't know, maybe younger men don't feel that way. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. I think that at least at Middlebury College, we would be very interested to know what students think about this issue. So I'd encourage students that are interested in this to make their views on this known in any ways they can.
Is there somebody they should contact?
Any of the faculty in this group.
Okay.
You could also contact, we're actually meeting with Max Nardi and a couple people from the SGA, so you could work on it through the SGA to see where this takes us. But we'll be meeting with them next week, so if you did have some comments, it's one of the topics we're going to talk about a little bit. So that would be another possibility.
Yes.
Okay, it seems to me, I wrote this down because it's kind of long. Okay, it seems to me a sort of paradox because these relationships are pushed into secrecy because they're so taboo, which encourages less than desirable relationships, making them all the more taboo. So if open and public faculty relationship is more desirable, as you mentioned with that one example, are we to suppose that we should make these relationships less taboo and thereby more acceptable to encourage better, healthier relationships between faculty and students? I don't know if I made myself clear with that.
What do you think? Yeah.
It sort of gets to Susan's question before, and it seems to me that full disclosure of information may be able in some cases to help the voluntariness of the decision on the part of the student. But I'm still skeptical that disclosure of information can help the confidence of a student in a relationship like that. Can help increase that student's capacity to be able to understand all the consequences given their vantage point and the weight of that decision. So it seems to me that a policy of, say, opening the doors and having these relationships, in a sense, okay but very public, may address half of it, some of the power points, but not all of them.
And I'm not sure many people will do it. I think it's not something that either party would be interested in having public. Yeah.
One last question.
Looking at the legal side of things, is there a range internationally where countries do have a policy on consensual sex, and what does that look like?
Say it.
So looking at sort of legal, constitution, whatever, in different countries, are there policies on this?
No, although I remember talking, and this is really terrible, because it's no evidence at all, except talking to a couple of Italian professors who said sex in their country is common. And actually, when I was doing research, I picked up a foreign newspaper, it was a British newspaper, English newspaper, that had a big story about Italian universities and British universities. And they were all saying that in both countries it's very common. Teachers and students to have sexual relations. I have no idea if that's true. What part of Italy, what part of England, I really have no idea. It would be an interesting subject to follow. Next book.
Thank you.
Thank you.